So thank you all for joining us. We'll get started. So we always like to do a little introduction to the three biospheres before we get going. Now we're joined today by Dr. Allan Mee, who is a wealth of experience on surveying and work with birds in the Kerry Biosphere. So I'm delighted he's agreed to join us and share some of his experience and stories and knowledge. But first off, I'd like to invite Dean and Richard to say a little bit about their biospheres.
Okay, I'll go first, Richard, if you don't mind. So obviously we're from the Dublin Bay Biosphere. We're a biosphere within a capital city, which is not unique, but very rare. Over 300,000 people live within our biosphere, which certainly brings some benefits and also some challenges, as I'm sure you can appreciate. During this pandemic, we've been still working hard to try and connect with people, and we've launched a few programs which may be of interest to you, some of you. We've launched the Biosphere Award, which is aimed at young people. It's developed in partnership with Scouting Ireland. So it's a Scout badge, but it's also a badge available for any young person. And it asks young people to, first of all, connect with nature, learn a little bit about what's happening within nature, the processes that are going on, and then take some kind of action to help protect our biosphere. We have a Biosphere Challenge, which is aimed at community groups, which is a 10-week program with 10 simple steps of activities that they can do to learn a little bit about the biosphere and become a little bit more sustainable. So a couple of programs there that we're running that, like I say, may be of interest to people. At the moment, there's a series on TG Cahir called Ancuan, which is the bay. And if you want to know a little bit more about the Dublin Bay Biosphere, I'd certainly recommend watching that. It's a 4-part series. The third in the series was aired yesterday, and they're available on their website. So certainly worth a view. And that's it from us. And I'm going to pass you over there to Richard.
Thank you, Dean. Really excited to hear Allan talk today. So thank you, Allan, for coming to the Tri-Biosphere meeting here. The Isle of Man Biosphere is still the only entire nation biosphere, with our islands and all of our territorial seas all within the biosphere, with a population of about 80,000. And we recently announced our annual Biosphere Award winners, so have a look at our press release if you've not seen that. And just in the last couple of months, we've held some sustainable business training, which actually came from seeing what Dublin Bay had done with regard to the circular economy and sustainable business training there. And we thought, oh, really should do something like that. So we did a survey of what businesses wanted on sustainability, and we just did a couple of months of weekly training on that. So we're just waiting to hear back from people how they found that, think about whether we do that again. We've got a new government in now. They've just published that Island Plan, which will be going to Tynwald and maybe modified in the coming months. But it does include, quote, an environment we can be proud of, which does include itself ensuring that biosphere and environmental policies are embedded across government decisions and infrastructure, which is good to see that it's being noted at a high level there. Though, of course, we have an island fauna, so it won't be as long a list of birds, for instance, as adjacent larger islands. We do have some specialities like a good hen harrier population, excellent chough population. We've got colonies of little terns and Arctic terns. We've got black guillemots, which are fantastic because you can see them down in Peel Harbour nesting around the harbour wall, so you can get quite close to them, get lovely views there. And we've got a growing buzzard population. They only arrived very recently as breeding birds, are now expanding across the island at the moment. It's not all great though, of course. We are worried about seabird declines. There was the recent seabirds count census. We're worried that breeding teal and windchat could well be disappearing. And we may have already lost yellowhammer and corncrake in relatively recent years. But there is hope as well. So we've got a Manx shearwater population breeding, which is recovering from pretty much none 20 years ago, with a large rodent eradication that's gone on the Calf of Man. That's growing population. There's interest from puffins down there now, with some resin puffins having been put out following the work on the rodents, and plain calls, because we've got very few puffins now breeding, really just literally a few. So there's hope there yet. And the Ornithological Society has a project putting out boxes for swifts to aid the swift population there. So they're all very hopeful. And just published by Manx BirdLife is Birds of Conservation Concern for the Isle of Man, which is the first time we've done that, which is really interesting to compare that with the UK and Isle of Man list on that larger area. And it brings out what's happening at a local level. And that's really interesting to look down that. That was just published this summer. So if anybody's interested in Manx birds, have a look at the Manx BirdLife website. That's all I want to say just now, but yeah, anybody's interested in Manx birds, then it may come up in the Q&A later when we've heard a bit more about Kerry.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Richard. I love to hear how the biosphere is every time. I suppose I'm only in the job a year. And so it's great to have these networks of biosphere reserves that we're able to connect to and learn from. And I feel there's so many shared projects that are emerging or that are kind of being passed around so that we can all benefit from everyone's experience. It's a great part of working in the Biosphere Reserve Network. So I'm just going to quickly share my screen and talk a little bit about biosphere reserves, just to give everyone a brief introduction and talk a little bit about Kerry before we hand over to Allan. So the Kerry UNESCO Biosphere Reserve is located down in southwest Kerry. It is managed in partnership between South Kerry Development Partnership, which is the organisation that I work for, the National Parks and Wildlife Service, and Kerry County Council. So what is a biosphere reserve? So they are internationally recognised areas for their biodiversity value, but they are also actively managed to promote a balanced relationship between people and nature. So on the Dublin Bay website, you'll see this lovely quote that says, "Where people and nature connect." And I think that really encompasses what a biosphere reserve is trying to achieve. So they're designated by the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. And the Man in the Biosphere Programme was launched back in 1971. Now, the two Irish biosphere reserves were one of what we call the first generation of biosphere reserves. They were both designated back in the early 1980s. So it's been a long-standing programme in Ireland, but it's become much more active in recent years. Now, globally, I actually think that number needs updating. It says 714, but I think there's almost 713 now after the last updates across 129 different countries. So it is a global network. Now, there are three sort of key elements that a biosphere is addressing. The first is conservation. So it's looking at protecting biodiversity and cultural diversity. We also look at development. So it's fostering an environmentally sustainable economy and society. And then there's an element of learning, which is what we're all here to do today, supporting environmental education and training and lots of research, monitoring and demonstration projects. Now, in Kerry, we've just secured funding as well from the National Biodiversity Action Plan and Kerry County Council. That's going to fund some work on Upland Bird surveys that will be carried out by Allan Mee himself in 2022 during the survey season. So it'll be interesting to follow that research and see what the results are from it. So the Kerry Biosphere is a mountain biosphere reserve. So it incorporates the McGillicuddy Reeks and the Paps Mountains over in the east there. And our core area is Killarney National Park, which is a well-known place for its uplands and its woodlands and lakes. The McGillicuddy Reeks, of course, are the highest mountains in Ireland. And we do have an agri-environmental project working in the area that supports farmers in promoting good environmental practice. And what we hope in the future is that some of the survey work that Allan will be completing will inform future management practices to help support our upland bird species. So that's really the driver for this research that we've funded. The Kerry Biosphere also has the only Indigenous wild herd of red deer in the country. There's over 140 bird species. There's several bat species. There's a number of rare invertebrates, including the Kerry slug, the freshwater pearl mussel, the northern emerald dragonfly. There's a number of rare and legally protected plants like the Kerry lily, the Killarney fern, and there's a new discovery of vascular plants as well, particularly in Killarney National Park. There's a huge amount of research continuing in Killarney National Park on the plants there, and they keep continuing to find new species, which is always very exciting. So the contact details are there. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter and on our website. So if you ever any questions or looking for information or want to share some work that you're doing in the area, do get in touch with us. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and hand over to the star of the show today, Dr. Allan Mee. Thank you so much for joining us, Allan.
No worries. Thank you, Eleanor. Yeah, I'll see if I can share my screen here now. So, and the other thing I got to do. Share. is share sound as well. I'm trying to that. Okay, can you see that?
Yeah.
I'll get it in the right mode. Should be. I'll just check there.
Yep, that's full screen for us now.
That's it, full screen. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Eleanor. Thanks, everyone. Yeah. So I can skip the first about 3 slides now because you've done all the intro, and I don't need to repeat all the stuff you've covered so well, Eleanor. So that's good. Yeah. Thanks for having me. It's Allan Mee. I've worked on Wagtail Eagle, the Wagtail Eagle reintroduction specifically since 2007. But living in Kerry, of course, got involved in looking at quite a lot of other upland birds, particularly ring ouzel, the bird up there on the top left. So see, these are some of the birds I kind of focus on today. They're mainly birds of conservation concern rather than the more widespread, say, woodland birds, and they're upland birds largely. Eleanor's covered all this. You'll see this is the Kerry Biosphere Reserve. So I'll really skip that. But I'm going to concentrate largely. Don't know if you can see my pointer there, but in this area here, which is kind of west of takes in Killarney National Park, and this area here to the west, rather than this area over here, which is in itself interesting because up on this area here, you'll see the area of just north of there, you've got a good area for breeding hen harrier, and down in this, I guess, the southeast on the border between Cork and Kerry, then you've also got breeding hen harrier and merlin. But I'm going to concentrate in this area on the west, which is called the Iveragh Peninsula. So this is the area really that I'm talking about here. So part of it is Killarney National Park, which is also an SPA for birds designated for merlin and actually Greenland white-fronted geese. Unfortunately, since designation, the Greenland white fronts, which wintered in Killarney National Park, have disappeared. That's the kind of story of a lot of parts of green and white fronted populations in Ireland, really. So they're now largely, apart from a few other populations, concentrated in Wexford. The other area that Eleanor mentioned again is now an special area conservation. That's Killarney National Park, McLoughlins Glen, and the Carrow River catchment. So this is kind of the core of the area that I'll be kind of focusing on. Yeah, it's an upland area, as Eleanor said. So the highest mountains in Ireland is McLoughlins. This is the Hag's Glen, one of the most well-known areas. Of course, if you're hiking in the Reeks, you can see the track coming up the middle there. It's very well used. I don't know what current numbers are. They would certainly have gone down during the pandemic, but yeah, numbers can be quite high using the Reeks. Eleanor can answer that question later, maybe. Yeah, so this is another area, really upland area in the Reeks. And although when I was working on White-tailed eagles, I was interested in other upland birds, specifically ring ouzels. So these are the typical really habitats ring ouzels and some of the upland birds are found in. Of course, it looks quite different in the wintertime. This is I lived for 4 years in the Black Valley, which is one of these pretty dramatic valleys in the Reeks. It was actually the last place in Ireland to be electrified in 1978. So this was the winter in 2010 when the whole place froze over largely for a couple of months, and it was hard to get in. It was a good excuse not to leave the valley to go to work. So working from home was definitely on the cards then. You can see that even the lake there in the foreground frozen over. So it was pretty amazing. Yeah, and this is what the tops of the Reeks looks like in good snow. We haven't had good snow cover for a while, really, sign of the times, but when it is snow covered, it looks pretty spectacular. So I'm going to concentrate on these birds here. Really, the latest list on birds of conservation concern in Ireland is just being published this year. So some birds have dropped to the amber list of medium conservation concern, but as as in the UK, you know, more and more birds are making it onto the red list. These are the birds of highest conservation concern, birds that, you know, could become extinct if we don't take conservation action. Like a number of these birds now occur in the area where I'm talking about today. So I've highlighted those in red, the ones to concentrate on. But if you look at some of the other ones, I think Richard mentioned corncrake on the Isle of Man, possibly gone. Yeah, corncrake has been lost for some time, potentially making a little bit of a, could possibly make a comeback. You know, it was also the corncrake once because they're migratory and winter in Africa. Once they're gone, you can't get them back. But birds have actually attempted to breed and bred for a number of years in the West Dingle Peninsula and also around Village Island, you know, calling birds. So with the right farm agri-environment measures, really there is a chance of getting corncrake back. Other ones we've lost, which probably once were common birds, like twice. You can see this bird here just in the grey wagtail. This was a mountain bird that we had that used to breed and certainly in the coastal areas in Kerry, has disappeared. Yellowhammer, large disappeared from Kerry. So really sign of the times, and the ones we were really worried about, especially breeding curlew and snipe. These are the amber listed birds: common sandpiper, merlin, chough, and skylark of medium conservation concern. So just concentrate on the breeding birds rather than the wintering birds. So, okay, I'll just try and minimize this a little bit so I can actually see what I'm talking about. So first up, a red grouse, certainly a species that of high conservation concern. The areas that in this that I've outlined here are the areas which definitely have still retain red grouse in the reeks. Quite a grouse would have been more widespread at one stage, but you know, they're really restricted to areas of heather cover, and you can see the from the map the breeding distribution of red grouse. Population has really declined pretty drastically throughout Ireland and the range of red grouse as well. So we're definitely going to concentrate on, when we're surveying in the reeks, on the status of the red grouse, and you know what could be done to improve conditions for red grouse to make sure we don't lose them. And there's actually a national survey, a repeat of the 2006-2008 survey, going to happen next year across Ireland. White-tailed eagles I'm not going to talk about just now because I'm going to concentrate on those in the second half, but you can see we've got a single pair in this area outlined in green. Obviously they just stick to that area, but got a breeding pair now on the lower lake in Killarney, and we've got other breeding pairs to the west of this area on the Ivra Peninsula, but they use all this area throughout the year on the reeks. Population is about 9 to 10 pairs. Kestrel is now on the red list. Hard to believe Kestrel's on the red list, and everyone kind of thinks, you can see from the map of Ireland, they're still really widespread, and you know most people would be familiar with Kestrel, so people would be surprised that they are on the red list. Those little blobs in green in the area are areas we know the Kestrel breed in this area. So again, it's a bird we'll certainly be interested in finding out more, getting a better handle on the breeding population. But nationally, you can see that the kestrels have declined by 34% in distribution and about 44% in population within Ireland. This is information from the Countryside Bird Survey that's based on a comparison of, you know, figures from now to what they were when the early days of the Countryside Bird Survey, maybe up to 40 years ago. Meadow pipit, again, a bird that would have been really widespread, and still is pretty widespread in the reeks. But again, you know, nationally, its population has declined by about 20%. Its range has contracted as well. So again, a bird that tends to it's really an upland bird now. We used to find it more in lowland areas as well, but it's still got a good population of reeks, so another bird will definitely be keen on surveying. These are some of the other birds red listed, the grey wagtail, amber listed, the common sandpiper, and the bottom I've thrown in dipper, even though it's on the green list. It's not a bird of conservation concern as such, but again, these are birds we will be concentrating on surveying along these areas here outlined in I guess pink. These are the rivers and streams that would hold dippers and grey wagtail, and those green dots are the areas we know certainly have. I know from my own surveying in the weeks that common sandpipers occur, and all these again are declining, especially the grey wagtail. 67% in population, still widely distributed, but population has declined. And common sandpiper is a bird close to my own heart, because I did my PhD on common sandpipers in the Scottish borders when I was at the University of Sheffield. So very, very enigmatic birds. And again, these are birds we will be surveying next year, thanks to the funding that Eleanor's got to the EIP. Bird that I've really, when I started to live in the Black Valley in 2008, I was really at the foot of the Reeks here, and it seemed the ideal place to have a look for this bird, the ring-ouzel, a mountain blackbird. Really didn't know much about it. It's declined drastically in Ireland. This is the last breeding atlas, and you can see pretty much confined to southwest Kerry and Donegal. Disappear from lots of places like Wicklow. Population decline of 40%. So these green bobs are actually singing male ring-ouzels, because they're most easily found by singing males. And they tend to sing only in the first couple of hours after daybreak, so you really have to be up in the hills pretty early. But they're one of the few birds that are singing up there, and they're really distinctive. That's a bird in the Reeks flying in the top right. Sadly, we were contracted. I was contracted to carry out a national survey by National Parks and Wildlife Service in Ireland this year, because you can see that the status of the bird is so drastic. And even worse than we thought, the population is believed to be only 4 to 9 breeding pairs. Those are 4 confirmed, but probably 9 breeding pairs in Ireland in 2021. Probably down for the turn of the century, turn of the 20th century. Probably we had thousands of pairs of ring-ouzels. So pretty drastic. These are some of the areas that ring-ouzels breed in. This area here, Eleanor, I'm sure you would know it pretty well. This is the area here above Lough Clee, and the birds bred on this cliff here, and this is this green blob here, and this is the Hag's Lane, the track up to Carrontool. One of the birds in flight. So these are the areas we found in the 21 survey. Unfortunately, it looks like as of 2019, we probably had our last breeding ring-ouzel in the Reeks in 2019, and they're now confined to Donegal. And the areas they're associated most with, you can see in dark blue, these are all tetrads, 2 kilometre squares that were surveyed for ring-ouzels, with dry heath, blanket bog, semi-natural grassland, and scree, which are classic habitat for ring-ouzels. This is a nest actually in County Donegal, with a nesting in under a boulder here. And these are typical ring-ouzel habitats: scree, heather. You can see all this. The bright green is bracken. This is July, and the bracken has actually been grown up. So this is an area that still holds breeding ring-ouzel. And of particular importance for ring-ouzels is this kind of mosaic of habitat. They use this dry heath for cover, but they often, like this pair, typically foraged up at the top here where it had been grazed or patches. So they like to go into these short grass grazed areas where they pick up earthworms. So they need really a mosaic of habitats, and over time a lot of that has been lost in the Irish landscape. So Another bird we'll certainly be interested in this, and actually was the subject of a national survey this year, is the chough, as Richard mentioned, on the Isle of Man. The population, this was the last national survey, and you can see the Iveragh Peninsula here, has some of the biggest concentrations, certainly down the southwest, some in Donegal. So the results from this year's survey haven't been published yet, but and the population had been stable, a little bit of decline in population, maybe in a slight expansion in range. I'm kind of predict that the population has probably increased a little bit, which is good news. From what I'm hearing, certainly in the southwest, you know, the birds now actually moving into there's birds that they feed a lot in these short grass areas, so they come into the reeks in the wintertime especially. But this little blob here is the Wagtail, and they used to breed there, and this year I had breeding a chough with two fledged young in this valley, which is the Bryda Valley. So they're probably overlooked. We've probably got more chough breeding, but they are mainly coastal. But about 10 years ago, we put up a lot of nest boxes in farm buildings, old ruined castles in County Clare. So we know that, and in slightly precarious sites like this off the coast, you know, the Cliffs of Moher. I won't be volunteering to do much of that down in Kerry, but yeah. So nest boxes were put up in quite a few areas. I know in West Cork, and birds have taken to those. So it's certainly something that you know, the farm buildings are often there, but they mightn't be suitable for nesting chough. But with nest boxes, we could see the really benefit the population. Some of these other birds like merlin, amber-listed, skylark, snipe even are now a cause for real concern. 34% decline in range. We don't really know what's going on in the reeks area, so we'll be certainly be serving these birds. As I mentioned, the Killarney National Park was designated for merlin, but to my knowledge, no one's actually ever found the merlin nest in Killarney National Park. So some of these areas were designated for the birds. The habitat look good, they must be there, but they've never actually been found. So again, finding a merlin nest would be anywhere in this area would be pretty good. But you can see declines in a lot of these birds. That's why they're red listed. So I'm bringing all the bad news, because obviously there are a lot of other birds that aren't, and some birds that have done better, you know. And so what can we do can we halt the decline? Looking at the ringers, some of the causes for possible decline are climate change, higher summer temperatures, disturbance by growing numbers of recreational users, large scale afforestation. But I've highlighted these because these are probably the key, certainly in Kerry and in Donegal. Loss of heather cover, loss of berries, because the young are particularly dependent on bilberries, or as we know them as hearts in southern County Limerick, or frockins in other parts of the country, and crowberry and rowan berries in other parts of their range. That it would be largely bilberries, and those have disappeared from a lot of the uplands. So restoring those, and these heather grass mosaics seem to be really important. So what can we do? Conservation measures, I guess. We know that results-based agri-environmental payment schemes are now working for a number of bird species, so working with landowners to deliver measurable benefits to improve habitat quality, which improves breeding success, and which we hope leads to population recovery. So certainly with the ringers, so we'd be looking at doing something of that before, because we know from the population is so restricted now that we really have a chance of losing them. I just turned off my timer there. I've hit 20 minutes. That seemed to be really fast. So we can also intervene directly to improve breeding success. We know from ground nesting waders that fencing really works at fencing out foxes, allow birds to breed successfully. Can be still tricky because once the young move out of those fenced areas, they can be predated. So controlling predators in some of these areas, because once the habitat has been altered, certainly afforestation usually leads to a higher number of predators, you know, in upland areas, and ground nesting birds can be very, very open to predation. So, but working with farmers like these areas here, this is improving areas in an area in Northwest Cork that I was involved in a LIFE project to retain this sort of grassland for species like marsh fritillary, which is a redlist an annex butterfly. But it's not, you know, I kind of went in this little section before I started White-tailed eagles with some happier tails. So birds that have come back. So this is a bird which now is starting to breed around certainly is breeding within the Kerry Biosphere. It's turned up around Killarney. This is the last breeding atlas, and this is the common buzzard, which has made a phenomenal recovery from a small population in the north of Ireland, or Wicklow, in the last 20 years, has now spread right across Ireland to breed. And this is some birds we tagged in. We were involved in wing tagging birds in North Cork for a number of years. Another bird that's made a comeback up until about 2006, we had no woodpeckers in Ireland. And don't know if they're likely to have come from Wales, these birds that colonized Wicklow initially. But it'll be very interesting to see what Nick's Bird Atlas shows, because they're now spreading pretty rapidly throughout Ireland. We now have breeding birds down in near my own area in County Limerick and in North Cork. And this year we certainly had a drumming bird in Killarney National Park. So once they certainly take off in Killarney, they're going to become widespread there, really, because it holds some of our, you know, most best native woodland. So it's really good to see those birds come back. So it can, you know, this with conservation action, we can restore some of these birds. Obviously, those birds restore themselves. Eleanor, if you don't mind, how are we doing? Okay for time?
Yeah, we have loads of time.
Yeah, I'm going to play a little short video, and then I'm going to take any questions on this bit, and then I'm going to start on the eagles, if that's okay.
That's perfect. Yeah. So if anyone has any questions, you can type them into, there's a little Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So type your questions in there, and we'll post them to Allan after the video.
This is about 2 minutes long, and I've pilfered it from the internet, so I hope Mick Green doesn't mind. But it's talking about ring ouzels, but I think it's relevant to Ireland.
Perfect.
Hello, I'm Mick Green. I've been studying a bird called the ring ouzel for many years now in mid-Wales. The ring ouzel is a small blackbird, one of the thrush family. It's the mountain blackbird. It looks very similar to blackbird, except it has a big white crescent on its chest. This is typical ring ouzel habitat. The craggy edges, heather-clad, where the birds will nest, and then down below in the fields where they'll go and forage for worms and other insects that they eat and feed their young on. Ring ouzels have been declining in Britain for the last 30 years at least, and we don't really know why. The habitat here doesn't appear to have changed. Although it breeds here in Britain, it migrates to the Atlas Mountains in Morocco, where it winters. Last year we managed to track ring ouzels on their migration route. We fitted a number of birds in Scotland with a device called a geolocator, which records day length, and you can turn that into latitude and longitude and find out where the bird is travelling. We had to recapture the birds when they came back from Morocco, and we only managed to catch one, but it gave us very valuable data and shows us that the birds come down from Scotland or from mid-Wales, down into southern Britain, down through England, across the Channel, down the west of France, down through the middle of Spain, and then over the Straits of Gibraltar onto the wintering grounds in Morocco and Tunisia. So we think one of the problems might be on the migration route, and that's hopefully the next thing we want to look at. If people are interested in the ring ouzel, they can go to our website where they can look at more details, and they can give us any observations that they have in ring ouzels, either in the hills during the breeding season or on migration as they come down through southern Britain. we're really keen to get as many sightings as we can. And there's a button you can click on the website to give us the sightings. We're also obviously looking for donations to carry on the research. Money for ecological research in Britain is very hard to get at the moment, so all donations are very welcome. Thank you.
All right, Eleanor, so hope that's
great stuff. Yeah, hold on one second now. I'm just going to make sure that I think everyone should be able to see all of the panelists that are here now. So we do have a few questions coming in the chat there, Alan, if you're happy to face a few questions for us.
Sure, yeah.
The first one that we have has come in from Niall Watts, and he has asked, can we participate in the rare or at-risk bird surveys, and if so, how?
Yeah, like most of the survey work, you can see the little maps that I showed there are from the last breeding atlas, which was in 2007 to 2011. They're, I think, repeated only every 20 years. So the next one, I guess, will start in about 2017, if all going well, funding, which isn't that far away, really. If he's in Ireland, you know, you can participate. There are a lot of survey work going on, and citizen science and, you know, volunteer effort are really, really important. So Birdwatch Ireland run carry out a lot of surveys. So it's certainly, like, probably the most important thing is to get involved in surveying really common birds, because we know, yeah, when I showed the, like, 20 years ago, if you'd said that species like snipe were going to become rare and going to be on a amber or red list, you wouldn't have believed it. But it's only by looking at the data with that's really been generated by the countryside bird surveys and things like iWebs for the waterfowl, their wetland bird surveys. Those are really invaluable. So I would suggest getting involved in looking up any of the Birdwatch Ireland surveys and getting involved in those.
Alan, and the Biodiversity Data Centre have a section where people can upload their sightings, and that can be year round. So you can.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, good point. Yeah, yeah. You don't have to just you know, your data, even the casual data, can be very, very important. And as well, I know just at the very minute, the most, not the most basic of surveys, but it's the most one, the easiest one, and maybe a fun one you can get involved in, is actually the garden bird surveys, which have been going on for quite a few years. So that's actually just kicking off now, and you know, you could Google that garden bird survey. And Birdwatch Ireland are running that, and you literally do that from your window, you know, looking at what's in your, so there's a lot of stuff you can involve in. Like, yeah, the Biodiversity Centre is a great one, and it's a kind of fun place to look at the maps and see where birds are, and just submit any of your data as well, you know.
I suppose the garden bird survey that you mentioned, I mean, that's a great one for kids to do in school. That's something they could do in school as part of their schoolwork. So, and all that information would be a big help, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and I suppose really important as well to mention, like you said, to record the common species, because like the changes that we're seeing now were not predicted 20 years ago. Like you said, there's a lot of species where we would have, you know, we would have almost laughed to think, oh, we're concerned about them now, if you just said it to us like when you started your career. So don't underestimate how important even participating in things like the garden bird survey are potentially going to be in the future when we continue to try and conserve these species.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, surveying rare birds can be, I would definitely start with your common birds, because surveying rare birds can be fairly, it's interesting stuff to get involved in, but it can be pretty hard going, you know. So because by the nature of some of these birds in the uplands, they're difficult to get to. Some of these areas, they're remote, and they're at very low density. So some of the birds, so find your common birds first.
Fantastic. And there's another question there that's actually coming from the Isle of Man, from Bríshi, who's asked, what has caused the loss of habitats you mentioned earlier regarding the birds of conservation concern?
Yeah, generally, I mean, the biggest factor certainly would have been the UK and in Ireland has been agricultural intensification. Really, loss of farmland birds in particular have declined at higher rates, and specialist birds like curlew have declined at higher rates than other species. So it's generally farmland intensification. And so, you know, there are other things that play into that with farmland intensification, birds being, I suppose, more pushed into breeding in little smaller areas and islands of good habitat, then obviously they're more prone to secondary effects, if you like, of predation, you know. So and we know certainly from corncrakes that were once widespread, you know, 50 years ago they were still breeding in every county in Ireland almost, and now they're largely confined to the offshore islands. So we know it can happen really, really fast, but we know with conservation effort we can turn it around, even at the scale may be small, but you know, it's important that we don't lose them completely, you know. And that's where agri-environment schemes are really important.
I was going to ask, we're hearing a lot about, you know, changes in the way people are farming to become a little bit more sustainable, if you like. Are you seeing that on the ground? Are you seeing those changes? And is the support there for farmers?
Yeah, it's kind of mixed, I would say. Yeah, these results-based agri-environment schemes have really taken off to large, which is brilliant. I suppose it started with the Burren, you know, the Burren Life Scheme, started as a life project, and now the success of that has kind of really generated other projects. And I know, Eleanor, you're involved with the EIP and in Kerry that pay farmers for measurable results, and that's important, because so the old schemes in the past, we had started off with the REP scheme, and then you had various other schemes like GLOS, and they were limited. I guess when you looked at the measures might have looked good, but a lot of them didn't have actually measurable benefits for the birds or species that they could have benefited. You know, so the birds were still being lost, you know, either to range or population decline. So these results-based schemes are definitely probably the way to go. The important thing is probably to get them at a bigger scale, because they're a little bit of a patchwork, and I think it is the same in Britain, but it's just to scale them up. So there are large areas of intensive grassland or large areas of intensive tillage that don't have any such schemes. They tend to be in the more marginal areas, you know.
Yeah, definitely here in the Reeks with the European Innovation Project we have operating here. The approach they take is very locally led, and the farmers that are involved in it, they work with the project team to develop a management plan specific to their farm. So I think that locally led approach that is allowed through the EIP programs and through some of the agri-environmental schemes that are running has a really positive effect. And I suppose that's really one of the massive benefits of having those schemes in the area, and that you're sort of looking at it on quite a small scale, but having taken that landscape approach then and joining up the farms together to have the effect overall. And we are seeing big improvements in a lot of the areas, which is great to see. So hopefully those will continue into the future. But I suppose this conversation always comes back to funding at the end of the day and how that's going to be distributed and managed. So hopefully the new CAP will come out and support that kind of work.
Yeah, absolutely, Eleanor. It's important. You know, funding is critical. You can have all the best designed plans in the world, but if they're not funded properly. And the other thing is some of these schemes tend to last only 4 or 5 years. So I think, you know, if they're not continued, farmers generate results for 4 or 5 years and then the payments stop. What happens then? So I think continuity is really important, you know.
Yeah, taking a nice long view and sort of implementing that longer approach. There's another question in the Q&A from Sean O'Brien, who has asked, what are the suspected or known causes of the decline of the grey wagtail?
Yeah, well, the grey wagtail is really a bird that is like a bit like the dipper and the common sandpiper, tied to riparian areas, water areas. So, you know, generally, if you good populations of grey wagtail, dipper, and to lesser extent maybe common sandpiper, it's if you got good populations and you're not seeing declines in areas, it's a pretty good indicator of, you know, good environmental quality, especially water quality, because they are largely feeding on invertebrates in the streams and rivers, or close to the streams and rivers for grey wagtail. So yeah, it's mainly probably, we know ourselves throughout Ireland, the decline in water quality has been pretty drastic. I think like something like there only is something like 50 rivers in the whole of Ireland that are now, or is it less in fact, that are now called pristine water quality. So where we had, you know, it's so certainly that's had a big impact. But the good thing about it is we still have got good numbers, I think, in the reeks area. So and certainly afforestation would have had an effect as well, because in the past, certainly the large scale afforestation in the uplands, forestry would have been planted right up to the edge of the stream, and this had a knock-on effects and acidification, which again would have impacted the water quality and prey availability for birds like dippers and grey wagtail.
It's really interesting how you mentioned water quality as a concern for bird species as well. So we did a talk in September where we had Breda Moriarty, who's our local area water conservation officer, and she focused on the water quality in the biosphere area and some of the projects and actions that they're taking to promote it. And we also had Stephen from the Pearl Mussel Project talking about some of the actions they're taking with farmers as well. And of course, the Pearl Mussel Project is focusing on the habitat for the pearl mussel, and the Law Pro are obviously focusing on water quality. But it's interesting to see that knock-on effect that water quality can have right through the ecosystem, affecting even bird species that are found in the area of rivers. Like,
yeah, totally. And that's where projects like the Life Project, you know, for the pearl mussel, Kerry Life Project would have benefited more than the pearl mussel, you know, would have benefited all these bird species as well, you know. So great
to see that's taking action in some area can have that knock-on positive effect as well, while we keep focusing on the negative sides. There's always something good coming as well. And there's one more question, so I think we'll take that question and then we might move on to the eagle section of the talk, Allan. So Damien has asked about wind farms and their effect on ring ousel. Do you think that wind farms, particularly in Spain through their migratory routes, could be affecting the populations?
The short answer is no, I would say. Yeah, because I know a lot of the work has been done in Britain on ring ousels, and that has never really appeared at all as a potential driver of population decline. The biggest impacts, the biggest drivers of the decline of the ring ousel seems to be birds not returning to, or the survivorship of adult birds, or return rates, and so they seem to be breeding okay in some of those areas, but their populations are being lost over time to habitat change, largely in the breeding grounds. But we don't know totally what's going on in the wintering grounds, because they're wintering in the Atlas Mountains, and we know that that certainly loss of they seem to be, juniper berries seem to be the most important food source for them in the Atlas Mountains, but there's also a big one of the only sources of firewood for people living in the Atlas Mountains. So again, wind farms, not really, but it could be, if there were wind farms in the breeding areas, that could certainly be a factor, but it's not really, not at the moment, not for ring ousel.
Excellent. Great stuff. So if you're happy to, Allan, we'll jump on into the next section and hear a little bit about the Kerry Eagle. Now we keep, I think Richard maybe keeps dropping in and out. I know he did have concerns earlier about his connection, so hopefully he'll get back with us later in the talk.
Okay. Did you hear the sound okay that time on the video?
Yeah, it played perfect.
Good. Okay, let me see that okay?
Yep. Perfect.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm gonna continue on white-tailed eagles. I just skimmed over white-tailed eagles. They are red listed. Oh, that's my timer. I'll let you keep me straight on time, Eleanor, if I overshoot here. So you see the maps on the left-hand side. This is from a paper in bird study in 2012. So this was looking at white-tailed eagles in blue, and reds are a golden eagle. Black could be either. So these were the areas that historically had held eagles, and this was derived from really place names associated with eagles, and there are lots of those in Kerry, like Slieve Iller. Iller is the Irish word for eagle. So, and these are some of the last breeding sites. The little dots in green, I don't know if you can make them out, are white-tailed eagle nest sites. Big lot in Kerry, Connemara and Mayo, and these would have been the last breeding sites. So the last actual breeding was in 2009 in North Mayo. One of 7 raptor species that are lost in between the 18th and 20th century. Happily, buzzards, probably marsh harriers and red kites have now back breeding in Ireland. So we've seen a recovery in some of those populations. Marsh harrier and osprey look like they're going to recolonize. Goshawk have re-established the population in Northern Ireland. And the reasons why are pretty well known. Certainly from all the old Victorian writing on these birds. Egg collecting, shooting, and poisoning were the main reasons for the extinction of most of our birds of prey, and certainly the white-tailed eagle. So hopefully now we're living in more enlightened times. So it seemed a good time for reintroduction of these bird species. A lot of the persecution of certainly birds of prey in Ireland were on the large landed estates associated with game rearing. So all those estates are largely broken up now. So we don't really have the kind of large scale driven grouse shooting that you have in the north of England and Scotland. I'm not going to, I can skip a lot of this. It's a bit technical, or with justification for reintroducing species like white-tailed eagles. On the top left there, on the left-hand side, that large bird of prey is a California condor, and the largest flying birds in the world, and reintroduced back into California after becoming extinct in the wild. And look, I was happy to, before I came to Kerry, I spent 5 years in California working on those birds, amazing birds. So a lot of these species like bearded vulture, kakapo in New Zealand have, populations now being restored, or certainly increasing as a result of reintroduction. And these are where white-tailed eagles, this yellow area is the area where white-tailed eagles, yellow and green actually, white-tailed eagles occur in their northern Palearctic birds, northern Europe and Asia, right across from Siberia to northern Europe into a population on Iceland and actually Greenland as well. So this over in Siberia, the overlap with this bird, which is even bigger, one of the largest eagles in the world, the Steller sea eagle. You can see there's those birds in flight are young white-tailed eagles, and there's an adult white-tailed eagle in there, and all the other birds are Steller sea eagle, an amazing bird. They were successfully reintroduced to Scotland in 1975 to 85, and there's an ongoing reintroduction now in east of Scotland and in southern England on the Isle of Wight, and over 130 pairs now in the north of Scotland. So we now got a reintroduction in Kerry. Birds came from Norway. They found the population, and actually a reintroduction going on the north of Spain started this year as well. The world population is about 24 to 50,000 adult birds. It's one of the largest eagles in the world, wingspan of 2.4 meters. They are primarily fish eating and a site faithful with long-term pair bonds. So our founded population came from Norway. It wasn't hard for us to to think about where we wanted to go and get birds, because Norway, with maybe 2,500 to 3,000 pairs, seemed the obvious choice. This is one of the areas in Norway. You can see those fish cages, salmon cages out, which are quite an attraction to white-tailed eagles out in the fjord. These offshore skerries. More typical habitat for breeding white-tailed eagles are these forested areas, but they also even nest in practically on the ground in areas where there are no ground predators. And so more typical nest for a white-tailed eagle, large nest up in the tree in a fjord. So so the birds were brought to Killarney National Park. So this is Killarney here in the release area, over here in the lower lake in Killarney. They were held for 5 to 8 weeks, depending on their age, and released from large flight pens. So this is Killarney. Looking across, the release area would be in this area here. And the birds are held in these cages, about 4 meter square cages, for about 5 to 6 weeks, isolated from as much as possible from human contact, and fed mainly fish and crows before they're released. And before the birds were released, we wing tagged them. Some of the birds had satellite tags or radio tags, so we could track them in the wild. You can see these tags were invaluable for birds being reported by the public and tracking the birds once they left the release area. But these satellite tagged birds really showed us, how much the birds use the whole of Ireland, really, as a kind of biogeographical range unit for white-tailed eagles. And this bird, you can see the dark green area, the dark purple area was where it settled to breed up in Connemara. And typically they stay around the breeding area, then for their other release area for the first few months before dispersing. And they dispersed over much of Ireland in their second and third calendar year. So while I'm talking, I'm going to play a video, these little short animations. And this is a bird that was released in 2008. So you can see where it went. So at least 7 birds went to Scotland before returning to settle to breed in Ireland, but at least 1 female is now breeding in Scotland. So this bird went up to the Orkney, all the way up to the Orkney Islands. Hard to speculate, but it was 2/3 of the way back to Norway at that stage, and it could have just kept going, and if there hadn't been the North Sea, and so it decided to turn around after 8 months away and return to Killarney. And it looked like this bird was going to head back up to Scotland the next year, but the transmitter stopped working, unfortunately. And the bird, by about 2 years later, the bird was nesting. We had paired up down in the southwest of Ireland, the Beara Peninsula. And this bird should be of interest to Richard. I'm just going to play this bird. This bird came from a wild nest up in Connemara in the west of Ireland. So it's starting to move around the west after release. Headed up, crossed over into the north of England, spent about 6 months in the north of England, and then it reached the Isle of Man in December of 2019. So it spent Christmas on the Isle of Man, so before returning to Ireland. And this was the first white-tailed eagle on the Isle of Man, I believe, since 1930. And I know there were discussions on possible reintroduction of white-tailed eagles to Isle of Man, and I talked to Neil Morris of Manx BirdLife about this. So a few locals were tracking the bird while it was on the Isle of Man. So it was pretty cool to see these birds really treat the whole of Britain and Ireland as their playground, if you like. So as birds got older, by the 3rd and 4th years, really, birds were establishing territories, and most of these territories tended to be southwest of the release area. So really cluster those in Kerry and the Iveragh Peninsula and the Beara Peninsula and West Cork. Birds on Lough Derg on the Clare and Galway and Tipperary, and also pairs over in West Galway. And most birds settled about in this area about 50 kilometers from the release site or from their nest site, with more birds settling in these areas here, which are about 120 to 160 kilometers away. And the ranges during the breeding season can be quite big. So this is a female in her range all year round during 1 year, and this is her during the breeding site. So the nest is just around here. So during the breeding season, their ranges can be tiny, pretty much. Like the male is obviously doing a lot of hunting during this time, so he's probably hunting over a wider area, and she's really confined around the nest. But and he brings all the food in at this stage. She starts to hunt as the chicks get older. So, and this is one of the first nests in Ireland in this was in 2012 in Mount Shannon in County Clare and Lough Derg. So you can see it's a big stick nest. So so it was interesting that after our releases in Kerry and Killarney and all the work that had been done there, our first birds absconded to County Clare to breed. So what's been happening with the breeding population? These are some of the nests up on the left. This is a nest up in County Galway, a nest in West Cork, and this is one of the first young that fledged in the wild in Ireland. So birds started to breed, males and females, in about their 5th year, and they've been fledging about 1.3 young per successful nest. So as you can see, our numbers are lower than the Scottish reintroduction, but I'll get on to why that might be, and we're hoping that, over time, as birds become more experienced, that the success of the birds will increase, and that seemed to be the case in Scotland. So the milestones: first pair breeding in 2012, first fledged young in 2013, and first Irish bred bird recruited to the breeding population in 2020, and now have 8 to 10 pairs breeding with 34 young fledged from nests in Ireland to date. And you can see the number of fledged young here seem to be on an upward trajectory up to about 2017. So unfortunately in 2018 we had a bit of a disaster in that our 2 best pairs, breeding females, were both lost to avian influenza, bird flu. And worryingly, we've had another bird die of bird flu in the last month, one of released birds, which is quite early in the winter, and they're picking up duck that are coming in, migratory duck that are bringing avian influenza in. And avian influenza can be fatal. So that really knocked the population back. So we had very little breeding success. Then the following year, we also had a lot of winter storms that were really taking out some of the nests. So we're hoping that with more birds starting to, once we get more Irish bred birds starting to breed in the wild, that our breeding success will improve. So as I mentioned, late spring storms really impacted breeding success the last 3 years. Avian influenza was a new threat we hadn't really thought of as being a big factor. But you can see here, most of our mortality has been to poisoning. And really that has largely been accidental poisoning. So up to 2010, poisons were still legal in Ireland. I'll just talk about that in a second again, but I'll come back to the other factors. A couple of birds unfortunately were shot, but it hasn't been a major factor. Turbine strikes, power line collisions, inter-conflict, that's white-tailed eagles killing other white-tailed eagles. So poisoning was banned, let's say, in 2010. Last confirmed poisoning was actually in 2015, but there probably still is some birds being lost to poisoning going on. It certainly declined. This is a bird picked up in Kerry Biosphere in 2010, it would have been. Again, largely all this was accidental because poisons would have been put out for foxes and crows. It was legal at the time. and since banned, and you know, we're not picking up poisoned birds anymore in these areas. So, and we're working closely with the farmers, and and hopefully have turned that situation around. This was our last bird confirmed poison found dead on the nest in Connemara, unfortunately. This is a bird that was taken out by a wind farm. We actually had 3 birds killed by turbine strikes. None since. This was back in 2012. So we're hoping, like, the major issue with wind turbines and wind farms for white-tailed eagles is sighting of wind turbines, bad sighting of wind turbines, literally, you know, sighting them close to breeding birds or in areas that white-tailed eagles use quite heavily. And this bird was one of our biggest females. She was a breeding female. She was actually on the nest at the time, and she was actually, we found all these lacerations on her head, and so we're speculation on what might have killed her. Until we did the post-mortem, we found talon marks in her breast, and within a week of her being killed, we found another female was trying to take over the nest. The male was still sitting on eggs at the time. Unfortunately, despite his best efforts, even hatching a chick on his own, the nest failed. And by the following year, the intruding female had taken over the nest, and they've been breeding ever since. So one of the, I guess, because the population is a little bit limited, you either hang around and hold the territory and wait for a male or female to show up. But one of the other ways is to skip the queue, if you like, is to fight your way in. And she killed one of our biggest females, and she's now taken over our territory there. So restoring a top predator requires long-term commitment. New threats may arise to threatened population. We also need a critical mass, really a good population to release, because when you take into account the losses over time until you establish a population, post-release monitoring and recovery of birds is really important to identify what those threats are. Things like avian influenza, and you need creative responses to eagle population recovery. Use of public sites. This was a site in County Clare, our first breeding pair. We hadn't planned to go public, but the birds nested right in front of the town, and it just seemed a brilliant opportunity to get the community involved. And really, since the birds started to breed here, the community themselves have taken on ownership of the whole project in that area. So that's really the way for the future, and kids watching the nest. And we even get the little kids in before they leave prams to read all the eagle propaganda. And it's critical to address perceptions or misconceptions regarding the threat of eagles to livestock. This was an issue for us when the birds first came in, certainly in Kerry, and we had to work with farmers. So this was Irish Farmers Journal, good to see Irish lamb back on the menu. But we hope we've turned that around. That was the perception, but now we've gone from that to working with farmers, and farmers now help monitor some of the nests. So this is a headline in the Irish Independent in 2018, from protest to partnerships, how farmers are supporting the reintroduction of white-tailed eagles. And this is a farmer in Lough Derg who monitors white-tailed eagles and really keeps me up to date on what the birds are doing. So it's brilliant that over the last, maybe 13, 14 years, we've turned that around, and hope farmers or the communities where white-tailed eagles nest are very much part of the long-term future, and that's so important. So it's these releasing white-tailed eagles is really a multi-agency, multi-person effort. So these are some of the people we worked with out in Norway, sourcing the birds. These were all really, really great friends of ours in Norway, and in Kerry, of course, where I lived in the Black Valley. Jack Casey here, the man here, was the postman in Black Valley, retired, now dead, unfortunately. But they were really great friends of ours in the Black Valley, and the farming community there were really important in getting behind the project. And then National Parks and Wildlife Service, of course, were major partners in the project. This is us tagging one of the birds. This is Brendan O'Shea, one of the retired rangers there, and this bird was christened Brendan in his honour on his retirement year. So Damien Clark going up at one of the trees to get one of the chicks and lower it down so we could be tagged. Claire Herdman, ranger in Glengarriff in Southwest Cork, holding one of the birds for tagging. Yeah, and a lot of the certainly hotels in Killarney would have been involved, Kerry County Council in the early days, and certainly funding the project. National Parks and Wildlife Service, of course, and Heritage Council, amongst others, and Golden Eagle Trust, and the National Parks and Wildlife Service and NINA were involved in managing the project over the years since 2007. So these are all the major players. So I'm just going to play some video now, Eleanor, if that's okay. And this is a site near the Upper Lake in Killarney, within the Kerry Biosphere, and this is a young white-tailed eagle. You can see the satellite. You can see a radio transmitter actually. The antenna sticking out its back, feeding on a Sika deer that I put out and put a trail camera on. And this was during the winter in 2010 when the Girrameen River completely frozen over. I don't know if you can hear any of the background raven calling, and you can see the great hooded crows and the ravens with the eagle for size comparison, so we've got a bit of action going to come up here. So the bird knows something's up. So another young eagle has just come in to compete. They're pretty. A lot of this is play, and you can see the second bird actually comes into shot here and joins the other bird, and they get along pretty good. They like to show off sometimes a bit of playing, but. So yeah, I'm going to move on to a second bit of video here. This is a short clip. This is a breeding female has just brought in some fish into the nest. This is in Glengarriff. And here comes, this is actually her chick from the same year. You can see the date up here is the 30th of January 2021. So this chick was fledged, left the nest in July the previous year, but it's still hanging out and still taking food off the parents. So definitely a home bird.
Bringing its washing home. Why not?
She's a very patient mom bird there, putting up with that.
Yeah, I'm just going to play a last bit of video here, but if there's any questions, really, I'm happy to take them while this is playing.
Perfect. Yeah, there is a couple of questions come in actually, so we can get started on those. Damien has asked about a pair of eagles in Derriana Lake and Waterville area. Can you tell us anything about those?
Yeah, there has been a pair in that area for several years. We don't, apart from the public sites, we don't really publicize where those birds are for various reasons, really to protect the site. But birds, this is actually what I'm talking. I'll just mention this. This is a chick, pretty well grown chick. It's probably maybe 4 or 5 weeks old, with the adult female in the nest here. This is in Mount Shannon, County Clare. It's in a Scots pine tree. Yeah, regarding that pair in West Ivora, yeah, that's still there. for whatever reason, they haven't been successful for a number of years. There was a trio involved. This happens sometimes. So in that particular case, there were 2 females and a male. And definitely when it comes to white-tailed eagles, 3 is a crowd, because they generally, those trios don't breed successfully. You usually get a second bird and it interferes with the breeding pair. So we're hoping over time that they will sort themselves out, you know, with more, this happens just mainly to lack of other mates, you know, and the second bird tried to get in an already existing breeding population. This is the male up in on Lough Derg. He's still there. Unfortunately, he lost his female. The female died due to avian influenza, like I mentioned, in 2018. So he's been on his own ever since. So whereas the other pair on Lough Derg has now, you know, has got a new female, and they've been breeding successfully. And this year, the breeding pair on Lough Derg, that pair reared 3 chicks in a nest, which is exceptional. You know, it's probably only happens in one in every 100 nests in Norway. So so that was really fantastic to get 3 chicks in one nest.
They really like it up there in Lough Derg then.
Yeah, it's so productive. Like it just shows you the Shannon River system is probably going to be really crucial, because, you know, it's so productive. There's no sound in this, unfortunately, the guys when they recorded it, you know, so these birds would just, they do this trumpeting call, which is really loud. You can hear it at least you know, a couple of kilometers away when they're calling.
Well, you said there that one of the males had lost its mate. Do they repair up after that usually, or is it common for them to stay by themselves for a time? Or
yeah, they do repair up. It can be, sometimes it can be quick. That appear, like in, well, I mentioned that the female that killed that female in and took over a choice. So whether through choice or not, the male paired up with that female, you know. So yes, it
sounds like she did a lot of convincing in that case.
yeah. So but the male in Mount Shannon has never paired up since. We don't know, maybe the right female hasn't shown up, but because I guess pairing up with the right individual is really important, because they're generally are paired for life. That it's important. It's important to be a bit choosy.
And how long are they active breeding? Like, how old do they get, and how long of their lifespan are they breeding for?
Yeah, so they generally breed from about age 5, but we know that they can go on breeding right into their 20s. You know, certainly year 20, 25.
That's quite a good age for a bird, isn't it?
So yeah, so and like to I guess to stabilize to the population over their life, they need, like, you know, every pair needs 2 individuals to then enter the population and start reproducing as well. So when you think of all those breeding seasons, that's not a lot, but over, you know, because, you know, they're higher mortality in young birds, and then some birds just don't get to breed at all. So it's important that, you know, that we get birds producing enough chicks, and in most cases we don't. You know, places like Killarney now have been consistently successful every year, but raising a single chick. They've never raised 2. So it kind of does seem that some of those upland lakes, like in Killarney, more upland, I suppose, the productivity fish-wise isn't, you know, the fish aren't as big as they would be in Lough Derg for a start, you know. Or
There is another question there in the Q&A that I'm going to fire at you now, because it's about white-tailed eagles. So white-tailed eagles are being discussed on social media as useful for the control of feral grey-lag geese. Do you think there's anything in this? That's from Neil Morris. Thanks, Neil.
If that's from who?
Neil Morris. Is that Neil from the Isle of Man?
Is that Neil from the Isle of Man?
Yeah, Richard's nodding, so I think it is. Yeah.
Right, yeah. I'd say not. because I know when birds were released in the east of Scotland, there was a case where, and you can probably Google it, when the birds were first released there, that one bird in particular settled on, I think it was the dean or the pastor, and some that near the release site that had free-ranging chickens and and geese, and he settled there for quite some time and took an interest in his outdoor farming pursuits. But like the birds released in, 100 birds released in Killarney National Park, within a stone's throw of one of the most internationally important brent geese populations in Dublin Bay and Castlemaine Harbour, and they spent almost no time there at all, which I wouldn't have predicted. I would have thought, like, brent geese are actually one of the smallest. They are the smallest species of goose, and yet we've seen no real impact. They've shown no interest in predating geese. So, and greylag are bigger, so I suspect they probably would have minimal, if no impact, or no impact on greylags.
That's good to hear.
They might what might happen is they may move them on, because maybe the fear of predation might be as important as actual predation, disturbance to the greylags. So they might end up having poor breeding success
because of the impact of eagles in the area. There's one question that's coming in the chat on choughs, so I'm going to ask that first, and then there's a couple more kind of relating to the white-tailed eagles in the Q&A, so we'll go back to the eagles afterwards. The first question is, are there breeding choughs in Kerry? That's from Elizabeth Brooks.
Yeah, they're pretty widespread. They're largely coastal, so I'm not sure the exact population of breeding chough, and it's probably over 100 pairs for sure. Yeah, they're widespread along most of the coast, and there are 2 or 3 SPAs designated specifically for chough on the coast, like Kerry Head and the Ivra Peninsula, designated, and Dingle designated for chough. So yeah, they're pretty widespread, less widespread inland, but they do come into the hills and the reeks in the wintertime.
Great stuff. So we're back to the eagles. I think they've captured everyone's imagination here. So do the white-tailed eagles, this is from Jean Hamilton, do the white-tailed eagles forage in coastal habitats in Ireland, or do they mainly use inland habitats?
Yeah, it's kind of a funny one, because like where the birds came from in Norway, the Norwegian birds were largely coastal. They are really, really coastal in Norway, because if you go inland from the coast of Norway, you're largely hitting big mountain areas. So most of the birds are breeding in fjords. So we really expected them to be largely coastal, or maybe some of the big freshwater lakes. But they've been a lot more, they've been using a lot more inland areas than we expected. A lot more, suddenly the big freshwater lakes seem to be really, really important. We've got some coastal breeders, and probably over time, but some of the fact that they've settled to breed in some of those areas have been related to where the breeding sites are. So we've had very little use up to recently of the Dingle Peninsula, which is surprising. But if you look at where all the areas of nice woodland, they often are where the old estates are, in the old landed estates, like the old in Killarney, and then down to the Ivra Peninsula. If you look at where the Bear Peninsula, where the old landed estates were, those trees that are maybe a couple of 100 years old. And these are the areas that are actually, because they like these big trees to nest in. Now they've started to breed. We have 3 pairs breeding in commercial conifer plantations owned by Quilta, but they seem to find these little trees mainly that haven't been felled for whatever reason, So those old trees are really, really important as breeding sites, but they will breed in deciduous areas as well, So, but yeah, they're probably restricted on where it's settling now, and they will move to more coastal areas because the food is there. Once once they're squeezed out of the areas where all the prime nesting habitat is,
Yeah, so the next question actually kind of links to that as well. Damien has asked, do the fish hatcheries have a supportive role to play? And maybe that's in relation as well to some of the fish farming. I know in the picture in Norway, there was obviously a lot of fish farming on the coast there.
Yeah, and fish farming. Yeah, in Scotland, I know they used to get into fish farms quite a bit, but all those fish farms now are covered. So eagles have they don't impact, they don't get into they may perch around the edge. And I know in some of the areas, certainly in Norway, you know, when they're pulling out dead salmon, they will throw them out, and then obviously the white-tailed eagles are attracted to that because they're largely sit-and-wait predators. You know, people think of them as these big predatory machines, but they're kind of big, slow dorks in some ways. You know, they sit around and they're much happier to go for something that's already dead, like carrion, or an easy meal like dead fish in that case, you know. Yeah, we haven't they certainly go into, like in the Black Valley used to come every year. There was a particular pool which was good for salmon spawning, and they used to turn up there every year. So I think they are definitely, they find these places in the uplands. So while we're thinking they're going up into the hills, and why they're spending all that time in the hills, they're probably finding some of those. They're amazing that they can find some of these little spawning areas, you know.
It's amazing that even though they've sort of been brought in from another country and released here, that they're still able to use their wiles and find those locations where they're going to have a good food source. It's quite remarkable how their instincts are driving that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, within a year, within like maybe 3 months of being released, some of the birds in Killarney were finding spawning areas. Like there's one near Loch Coos there, and they found that within a few months of being released, which is kind of amazing, you know, that they had no purely on instinct, no adults out there to show them. So it's great that they can do that, you know, and get back to behaving like they would in Norway, you know.
Fantastic. Richard, do you want to come in there?
Yes, thanks, Alana. Yes, Alan, about the sea eagles, I'm wondering, has there been any impact, either positive or negative, found on other wildlife populations in any way? And on the agricultural side, has there been any need for any kind of investigation or compensation scheme related to that?
Yeah, on the first one, like one of the, I guess the issues before the birds were released that we looked at, because they were at the time a lot of these areas were being designated, certainly the Skellegs and all these offshore islands of Blackbird have been designated as special protection areas, mainly for seabirds. So then, you know, also we had a little population of green and white fronts in Killarney, so the worry is what impact would the eagles have on those? But we've had absolutely, you know, it's the minuscule use of those offshore islands. So they've really not, you know, birds pass by. We know from the satellite data, and we've had now nearly 20 birds satellite tagged, that they've used these offshore islands where the seabirds are breeding very, very little. And so they've zero impact really on those breeding populations. Whether, you know, if there were the seabird breeding population on the mainland, maybe they would have more impact. I don't know, but certainly no. And looking at some of the Brent goose, like I mentioned, populations there, again, we're not seeing any impact whatsoever. It seems to be where the fish populations are really good, and there's also carrion for young birds on the hills. That's largely, you know, they probably, if they didn't have that, maybe there might be more of an impact, but we haven't seen that. The second, oh, you're talking about compensation. Yeah, when I know in Norway they went down that route because through losses of in Norway they compensated because they have a whole suite of predators from wolves down wolverines, lynx, down to foxes and white-tailed eagles and golden eagles, that they actually took the white-tailed eagles were taken off the list of birds of predators that farmers are compensated for, because they didn't recover all the carcasses of animals that were recovered, in mainly lambs. White-tailed eagles, they had no proven case of white-tailed eagles predating lambs at all. So we're actually taken off the list. Most of it seemed to be lambs that had died, or golden eagles killed them, and then white-tailed eagles found them. So so it really, we didn't really have to go down that route in Kerry, and it would have been difficult, I suppose, you know, because you would have to go down the route of, you know, proving that that white-tailed eagles that kill the bird, because in lots of cases they could be easily mistaken because they will be attracted to carrion, and we know that now. That happens now in Kerry because the birds are breeding in lambing areas, and the farmers know that themselves. And you know, in the early days, people would have been very worried about that. So I went out and checked those, checked any possible casualty out, and we were able to ascertain it was mainly either stillborn, could have been foxes, and the birds are coming down to predate a bird. So it's gone from worries about, you know, losses of lambs to actually, you know, the birds are there, and in lots of cases they're breeding, and people don't even know they're there. You know, they're blended in the background, or we'll say, "Oh, I've seen eagles, and yeah, they've been down around, but we left the we left the dead lambs out for them." And I just say, don't you know, don't encourage them. But you know, at the same time, it shows maybe how things, you know, people have got relaxed over the years about and coexisting very, very well with white-tailed eagles. So it's not really been an issue, you know.
That's really good to hear, because a few years back I chaired a feasibility assessment group after Nick Pinder here on the island made a proposal about seagull introduction. And this matter did come up, and the project didn't go any further at that time. But it's interesting to hear Neil say that there's a lot of discussion on the social media about this again. So, okay. Having seen Angus appear on the island a couple of years ago, I don't know what the chances are of them spreading. I mean, to what extent in Ireland have they actually spread away from the natal areas where they were introduced?
Well, they like I probably showed that graph there with the showing that most of the breeding population, the birds settle to breed within 50 kilometers of the release area, and birds tend to disperse widely in the first 3-4 years, then come back to breed either near the release area or the area where they fledged from, if they're fledged from a wild nest, say like Angus, which fled from the Connemara. He's now actually in Mayo, so he's probably 50 kilometers from his nest. He's a 2018 bird, so he'll be in his 4th year next year. So he should be getting down to think about breeding. So, but we've had one bird that settled to breed in Scotland, one of the original Killarney release birds. So you can have these birds that just for whatever reason shoot up. She might not be the only Irish bird that's ever bred in Scotland. We don't know for sure, but most of the Scottish nests are monitors, although they're not necessarily all tagged or colour rings. But there is always the possibility of birds overshooting. On the other hand, we've had no birds come. One of the reasons why we wanted to go ahead with rangeshooting in the first place was because there seemed to be no prospect of colonization of Ireland from Scotland. Like we've over the years since 07, we've only had one bird that we know of from Scotland actually venture across the sea to Ireland, literally for a couple of days and go back to Scotland. So they're breeding now as far south as the island of Islay. So they're breeding within sight of the Northern Irish coast. So it may happen that the two populations will merge to genetically to some extent as well as geographically. So, but probably it's hard to see without an actual reintroduction in the Isle of Man. Yeah, I wouldn't rule it out. Angus has shown us possible that birds, and maybe he's still got the Isle of Man in his brain somewhere and is going to turn up there again. I don't know. Is there a worry that on the Isle of Man that they might make an impact on the seabirds and the calf of Man?
It did come up in the discussion, yeah. Although the assessment, the results of the assessment were really that we didn't feel that there would be significant effects on either wildlife or livestock.
Yeah, I think like that would be the case. I know I got a few photographs sent to me by Neil from the Isle of Man and showed Angus out there in a field surrounded by various crows, ravens, or whatever, with a dead sheep. So it wasn't long in finding carrion. So
yeah, it was happily on the carrion there.
Yeah. So yeah, I know Roy Dennis was involved in that with Nick, I think, as well. in possible, in feasibility study or whatever. So I think Roy thought, might be the potential of maybe up to 6 pairs on the Isle of Man. But then I think the other thing was that people maybe thought they would, where would the young birds go? Would they just leave the Isle of Man and not come back, possibly colonize England, So
yeah, because you've got a small island, you'd have to put as you put it earlier, the critical mass in to get them to take. So yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, they've not been here for 200 years. The last pair were considered to, there was a report they died in a snowstorm in a farmyard. They were found under the snow, and that was about 1815, I think. And then was that one bird you mentioned in about 1930 that was shot on the islands that survived.
Yeah.
And then Angus. So there was basically one pair was on the island previous years at a site known as the Ernary. So it clearly was a long-standing sea eagle site on a hillside in an area without trees, actually, which is quite interesting in itself.
Yes, yeah, interesting, yeah. Like a lot of these birds originally would have nested at cliff sites. All their last nests were all cliff sites, but it's possible that was the case because they were the hardest to persecute. These were the most inaccessible, whereas tree nest would have been relatively easy, to get to and persecute. So but like so far the birds have shown no interest in cliff nesting at all. They're just going where the trees are. But if they didn't have alternatives, then they probably would nest on some of those cliffs, so
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We're actually well over time, so thanks to everyone for joining us and listening in today. But I honestly could sit and listen to more of this for even longer, Allan, because I think you have so much information on all the different bird species. It's great to have you sat here with us and answering our questions. So thank you so much for joining us and for giving up your time.
Thanks, Eleanor.
And to Richard from the Isle of Man and to Dean from Dublin Bay for joining us. And next month, I think we are putting our webinar on pause for December to give everyone a break. And then we'll be back in the Isle of Man in January. So stay tuned to all of our social media and newsletters, etc., to hear more details of that as the plan comes together. So thanks very much for joining us, everyone, and we'll leave it there for today.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Allan. Appreciate it.
Thanks,
again.
Allan. Thanks,
Cheers,
everybody.
guys. Cheers, Eleanor.
Thanks, everyone. Bye now. Have a good day.
Bye.